In general, I get a screenplay maybe 6 weeks or 6 months ahead of time. And I hope that I'm able to make some notes and give the director those notes. Sometimes I've done that and the director says, I don't like these notes, and then we part early, and that's good because that's a way of sort of testing the water before you actually dive in. But in general, the notes are received with interest. Sometimes they actually do some of the things that I suggest, but that's not a criteria. It's just a way for me to start getting into the story by thinking about it already and writing notes. I also time the screenplay, which not all editors do. I would recommend it because it's another way of sort of fitting yourself inside the suit of this film. To time a screenplay accurately, you have to do it 2 times at least. And to do that, you actually have to visualize everything that's on the page. Many problems, I think, in films come from the fact that something hasn't been thoroughly visualized. So there's some quirk. Anyway, that's another thing that I do to help get purchase on this material. I have something that's called the rule of 6. That's more about actually when you're doing the editing. It was an attempt to answer the question, in some ideal, let's say even Platonic world, what is a perfect cut from one shot to another? The strange thing about editing is, and cutting from one shot to another, is that before we actually started doing it, which was only 120 years ago, it might not have worked. It's the idea of actually splicing 2 different shots together and having the audience accept that as a continuous reality is surprising. It's surprising that it works. So this was a hit list, really, of criteria. And the top criteria was emotion, which is very difficult to quantify or qualify even. How does this transition from one shot to another make you feel? You have to keep your fingers on that emotional pulse as an editor and not really ever let it go. Your grip sometimes loosens a little bit, but it's like riding a horse. You have to always hold the emotional reins in your hand. Sometimes you actually have to jerk it a little bit, but hopefully not too often. After that is story. Does it help tell the story? After that is rhythm, and you can think of shots cut together as a kind of rhythm track. The syncopation of the cut, which is a big shift. I mean, a cut, lots of things change at that point. And that rhythm has to integrate itself within the rhythm of the actors and the rhythm of the camera work and other things that are determining the rhythm of the shot. And then there are 3 slightly less significant things, which you have to have a good sense of where the audience is looking in the frame, because they're not looking at the whole frame all the time. They're choosing to look at areas. And that determines how good a cut is. And then the so-called 180-degree rule. Does it look like 2 people are talking to each other? When do you violate that? When do you say, I don't care? I'm working on a documentary at the moment, and documentaries for the most part let go of that. The least significant, you can tell I'm going kind of down in significance. The last thing is what you might call 3-dimensional continuity, which is, did that person get up from the chair and walk across the room in a convincing way, or was it confusing where they are? In the early days of film, they paid a lot of attention to that, and you can look at film stylistically over the 20th century, and you can see that we've let that wander. Well, we were all film students Francis actually was at UCLA, and he was 4 years older, so I think he'd already graduated by the time I was in film school. George Lucas was also going to USC, as I was, and it was hopeless to think that we could work in Hollywood. And we were told this over and over by the teachers. In fact, the first thing that the teacher said on the very first minute of the first day was, you can still get your money back. You can get out now and go do something that will earn you a living because there's no jobs for you. 1965, which is when this was and still is the low point of Hollywood production. Fewer films were made then than ever since. And the teachers, who were all 20 years older than us, saw this slope clearly, and they thought it was just going to keep going. And so they sort of pitied us. Why are you doing this? When Francis and George and I started American Zoetrope up in San Francisco, the mood was, let's get out of this Hollywood thing and make films the way we made student films. We'll just make them bigger. That was the dream. And it went through many rocky periods and films that didn't, commercially anyway, succeed until The Godfather, and that was the first big film that we all worked on and that became a big hit. Godfather was the first time that I'd ever worked in Hollywood, in the bowels of the machine, so to speak. And I took chances and discovered that, in fact, even though it's this big machine, you can actually do these tricky things. And it's the scene where Michael kills Sollozzo in the restaurant, which happens about midway through the film. And Francis and Nino Rota had decided to have no music throughout the whole scene. And the other unusual thing was that it was a fairly long scene, the restaurant scene, and a lot of it was in Italian with no subtitles. I mean, that's a risky thing to do today, let alone 40-something years ago. So it threw the audience a curved ball. They didn't quite, what's going on? So there's no music, which usually guides you, and you don't understand what they're talking about. So you have to pay a lot of attention to body language and expression and the quality of the voice. But I thought, well, let's do something with sound that might help the moment. And because I grew up in New York, not far from where that restaurant theoretically was, I knew that there were a lot of subway trains that in that part of New York had come up above ground. And so they were elevated tracks. And those trains make a peculiar noise because the whole structure vibrates. And I thought, maybe we could introduce that sound and let it go away as if a train passed, and then bring another one in at slightly louder. And then as the scene goes on, 4 or 5 times, I can't remember, this train sound, which has no visual equivalent. There's nothing that introduces this sound. You don't know what it is really, unless you kind of intuit it. At the very end of the scene, Michael comes out of the restroom, and Clemenza had told him, come out blasting. In other words, come out of the room and shoot them dead. And he doesn't. And so we, the audience, are wondering consciously or subconsciously, what, is he not going to shoot them? He sits down and he listens, and now we think, but in the background, this train sound gets louder and louder and louder, and then it starts to screech as if the train is turning a corner or putting on the brakes. And as it gets louder, we're moving closer and closer to Michael's face, and Al Pacino is doing a really interesting thing with his eyes, kind of looking around. And then suddenly he stands up, pulls out the gun and shoots Sollozzo, and the sound stops. which means it wasn't a real sound. A real sound wouldn't have stopped like that. So the sound of the bullet kills the screeching sound. And some audiences are not even aware that there is that sound. They interpret the sound as we're listening to the neurons in Michael's brain because he's making this incredible life-changing decision. Not only to kill two people, but to kill the dream that he expressed at the beginning of the film, which is he's not going to be part of this family. It's adventuresome, particularly for the time, because there's nothing visually that corresponds to it, except the interior state of the actor, the character. And that was a lesson to me that even on a big Hollywood film where you think everything is just sort of by the book, that you can throw these curves into the soundtrack and actually enhance the film as a result. I was mainly influenced by the films that were being made in Europe and Japan and India. Kurosawa, Satyajit Ray, Bergman, Fellini, Godard. This is all the 1960s. And they sort of charged me up. And that was not only but our goal. I would say the same for George Lucas and Francis Coppola. We were all driven to make films, not so much by American films, but by world cinema. If you had drilled into our minds and said, what do you really want to do? It would be to make films in the United States, but to bring world cinema in as an influence. I love to collaborate, and I've worked on a number of films where I am one of 3 editors or one of 2 editors. One of the real advantages of digital filmmaking is this enhancement of the collaborative back and forth. You could do it in the old days. If there were mistakes, then it was hard to sort of pull back. You'd had to reconstitute the film, and there were these splices in there, and the expense of reprinting the films was considerable. And it did happen, but the tendency was not to happen. But with digital stuff, there's no reason not to do it. The situation is so different today. A machine that could edit film in Hollywood back then, the Moviola, cost the equivalent of $42,000 today. Whereas today, you can everyone has a laptop or something, or even an iPhone, and you can get editing programs for free, and you can download stuff for free. The upside of what people have today is easy, free access to incredible tools that we just didn't have. The downside is that everybody has access to, so the amount of competition and how to make yourself heard in the noise of the culture today that's problematic. But you can do something great and put it on YouTube and get 5 million hits, and there you go. Something will happen as a result of that.